Many moons ago, I worked in retail, and aside from dealing with everyone's coffee breath in the morning, it's a fairly enjoyable job, with the exception of the dreaded Black Friday weekend. It's horrifying. Endless lines, standing for hours with no real hope of it ending anytime soon. At times, confusing or conflicting information about what we were supposed to tell customers. It was the pits. Hey, more and more I think about it, it's kind of what it's like for some people to vote nowadays. I don't know why I chose that voice. Hear me out here. Endless lines, standing for hours with no hope of it ending anytime soon. At times confusing or conflicting information about what we're supposed to do as voters. Except we don't end up with 42-inch TVs at the end. Sometimes just shitty politicians who try to hold on to power way longer than they should. In order to hold on to power, sometimes state lawmakers try and discourage us from voting or render our vote meaningless. Like playing games with the census to screw up districts. More on that soon. Voter ID laws. General disinformation. The list goes on forever, and that's without a global pandemic to grease the wheels of bullshit. But they tell me I only have about 8 minutes for a segment, so let's focus. First, we have gerrymandering, which sounds like the reason why you had to file a restraining order against your creepy coworker. Basically, it's state legislators playing etch-a-sketch with districts so that those in power stay in power. The result is that representatives for certain districts don't match with the actual voters in their districts. So the representatives make decisions for your life fully well knowing the only reasons that they're representing you isn't because you voted for them, but is only because they gamed the system somehow. Don't believe me? See if the actual lawmakers can tell us differently.
That's a point that Lewis made in a remarkable display of candor on the State House floor back in February. The lines were drawn, in part, he said, to give Republicans the biggest possible benefit.
A further criteria was partisan advantage. We believe that this map will produce an opportunity to elect 10 Republican members of Congress.
Tight. Now you would think that the solution for this would be as easy as telling legislators, don't do that. But the Supreme Court decided in 2019 that the question of gerrymandering should be resolved by the lawmakers themselves and not something that the federal court should decide. To achieve this gerrymandered hellscape, state legislators use methods like packing and cracking, which sound like makings of a good Breaking Bad episode. To show exactly what these weird-ass districts can look like, this is Chicago's 4th Congressional District, which looks like the geographical representation of the Hammer Dance. To bring it locally to us here in Maryland, this is Maryland's 3rd District, which if this were a Rorschach test, I'd say I see bullshit. You might ask yourself, how do we stop this never-ending game of human Tetris? In 2018, Michigan voted to implement independent redistricting commissions, taking the power to reshape districts out of the hands of politicians. They did so by proposing what's called a ballot initiative. They were able to collect enough signatures from voters to get the initiative put on the ballot so that voters could decide for themselves what they wanted. Unsurprisingly, the measure passed convincingly, winning 61% of the vote, carrying 66 of 84 counties, both Democrat and Republican. This isn't a cure and is hard as hell to do, but if you're really tired of all the fuckery with redistricting, perhaps proposing a ballot initiative is just for you. To explore other ways that lawmakers screw with voters, there's a recent perfect storm of all the bullshit that voters sometimes have to go through in order to cast a vote. Here we have Dante's Inferno. Hell. Georgia's primary election. First, there's the issue of absentee balloting, or voting by mail. Fulton County, the most populated county in Georgia, and just so happens to have one of the highest black populations in the state, faced a backlog of vote by mail applications that froze email accounts and jammed printers. Side note, probably should have picked up a few printers on Black Friday. Fucked up. The situation was also complicated by Fulton County election employees getting sick with COVID-19. Beverly Walker, who was a registration officer, sadly passed away from the virus on April 15th. Fulton County told voters that they could email the county their vote by mail applications. But when the service and staff couldn't handle the thousands of emailed applications, Fulton voters, who had no ballot in hand, no email confirmation, and no update on the status of their application, understandably said, fuck this, and headed out to polling locations. Even Stacey Abrams, who famously ran for governor against Brian Kemp and was robbed of the victory, had to vote in person. She said, quote, "Although I applied for it fairly early in the process, when it finally arrived, the return envelope was sealed. I tried to steam it open because I watched a lot of Perry Mason. It didn't work, so I had to go vote in person." Who knew we would have to use methods we learned from fictional characters to try and vote? Now I'm realizing all that time watching MacGyver as a kid wasn't completely wasted. Take that, Mom. Just kidding, I love you. There should be an effort to make voting by mail better and expand it to everyone, but with people like Trump screaming about voter fraud at even the mention of it, it's a hard conversation to have. Even though for the last 20 years, fraud by way of voting by mail happens about 0.00006% of the time. If you want to know how small that is, you should try calculating 0.00006% of your paycheck. Really doesn't happen that much. And in a strange game of follow the leader, other politicians are taking Trump's lead. Take, for instance, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, who said that fear of contracting COVID-19 does not amount to a sickness or physical condition as required by state law. He also said that his office would prosecute people for voter fraud if they use vote by mail ballot in a matter he said was improper. Which is ironic because he used a voting by mail option in 2011 to cast a ballot according to county records. Doesn't necessarily mean he did anything illegal, just interesting. Back to our scheduled shit show in Georgia. Many voters who didn't get their vote by mail ballots had to crowd into polling sites that were consolidated because of the virus. Even though there was early voting, there were still issues with long lines with wait times of up to 3 hours plus. There are so many reasons why this happened, even on top of the vote by mail issues. Lack of or untrained volunteers, voting systems that didn't work, electronic vote processing devices and apps that didn't work. In the end, indeed, some people just gave up and went home without voting. But don't worry. After seeing the long lines at one particular location, officials ordered chairs for the elderly who, of course, were waiting for hours. But there wasn't enough volunteers to sanitize the chairs between voters. So I guess it's the effort that counts. Fuck. After all of that, the solution that Georgia officials came up with was, instead of fixing the vote by mail system, they chose to limit it altogether. So to be clear, with no true expectation that COVID-19 is going to be any less of an issue in the fall, thus probably having the same issues that they had with, everything, the solution they came up with was going backwards on pretty much the only way to keep voters from gathering in the same place. Well, that checks out. And if that wasn't enough, in the same proposal, the officials removed parts of the measure that would have required election officials to add precincts, poll workers, or voting equipment if voters had to wait in line for more than an hour in the previous election. Again, it's not a cure, but fortunately, political groups, advocacy organizations, and voting groups can still mail absentee ballot request forms to voters on their own. There's the old quote, "Never attribute to malice what can be adequately explained by stupidity." Our politicians seem to always have this plausible deniability. What, us? We're not evil, just a lot stupid sometimes. But at what point is it evil by way of stupidity? Here's why you should give a fuck. A cynical person would say all these fucked up things that happen are by design, designed to discourage you from voting. And it's not just Georgia. Every state is different, and so it's hard to break down each one of the individual cases in a 7 to 8 minute segment. But we the people need to keep a watchful eye, know our goddamn rights, and fight like hell for them. That's the point of this all. As citizens, this is our true power. And with the rest of the primaries this year, and with the general election in November, and with how democracy is supposed to work, supposedly, we've got a lot of choices to make. And we can't make them if we literally can't make them. That's why you should give a fuck.
Casting a vote is oftentimes the most politically active people will get. And that's not an exaggeration. According to a survey in the Washington Post, 76% of voters were classified as unlikely to be politically active beyond voting. So while you guys are out here doing the bare minimum, that doesn't negate the fact that the vote is a fundamental part of participating in the US political system. It is, however, important to point out that many are deterred from even participating in the voting process. The Native American community, for example, has faced a continuous and consistent fight when it comes to voting in the United States. From the beginning, the United States government has tried to exclude Native Americans from getting involved in the political system. Native Americans weren't even considered citizens under US law until 1924 with the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act. They had to wait even longer, precisely 38 more years longer, before all Indigenous Americans were given the actual right to vote. The last state being Utah, taking its good old time, but finally taking down restrictions on allowing Native Americans to vote in 1962, which really wasn't that long ago. And yes, before you ask, this community, the first and original people to have been living in the United States, are having to fight for their right to have a say in a country that they have been living in before everyone else. I spoke with O.J. Siemens, the executive director of Four Directions and a member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe, to talk about voting in the Native American community, along with the impact these voters could have.
We looked at the presidential election in 2016 and we saw the numbers. And what we determined was looking at the population of Native Americans in Arizona, in Nevada, in Colorado, in Minnesota, and in Wisconsin, and in Michigan, and in North Carolina. The number of Native Americans in all of those states, those 7 states, in their battleground states, the number of Native American in those states either exceeds or equals the number of votes that the candidate won those states by. And so what we're looking at in 2020 is to work closely with these states, or within these states with the tribes, to try to increase it. Had they participated at a higher number in 2016, we might have seen a different outcome in the last election.
In recent years, numerous changes to voting rights laws have made it more difficult for people to vote, especially for individuals in the Indigenous American community. A key moment in the effort to restrict voting rights was in the Supreme Court's 2013 Shelby County v. Holder case. The court ruled that a portion of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was considered unconstitutional. And this wasn't any regular section. Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 established a formula to figure out which states needed permission before changing any rules pertaining to voting. And the reason it needed permission, or pre-clearance as they call it, from the Department of Justice or the US District Court for the District of Columbia was because these states had a history of voting discrimination.
Their concept of, well, geez, there's no voter suppression, there's no need for this is totally out of whack. We, at that time, what we were looking at was to turn out the Native vote. And what happened was we found out they had so many barriers in place, and not just for natives, for basically people of color, that it was hard to turn out the vote in which it would make a difference in an election with these barriers in place. I mean, if you were a white person living off the reservation, they gave you 5 ways to vote. You know, if you're an Indian on the reservation, they gave you 3. You know, and you know, go to any basketball game, you don't have a winning team if you have 3 members and they have 5. And so it was just the hypocrisy of them saying that we as American citizens, we want to offer you this opportunity, when it was total bullshit.
Although Siemens mentions how numerous lawsuits had to be filed to address voter suppression, he explains how this issue can be tackled on a more micro level.
And honestly, you know, voter suppression doesn't start really in the legislative office. It doesn't, start in the governor's office. Voter registration at the very beginning started 3 feet away from you when you walked up to the table, and you had people standing there looking at you that wouldn't help you or give you the proper ballot. So voter suppression isn't just a government thing, it's a people thing.
Voting IDs have been another issue impacting the Native American community. In February 2020, South Dakota, a state with one of the highest Native American populations, rejected a plan to allow Native Americans to use their tribal IDs to register to vote. And while legislative branches have made an impact on voter registration, there's another issue to watch out for: the census. Census data collects population count, which is critical when it comes to adjusting or redrawing electoral districts.
Right now, a lot of people where they live, you can get your mail dropped off by your door, or you have a street address. Well, with Indian country, because we don't have street addresses, just like in North Dakota when they wouldn't let Native vote, the census went and followed the same step, in which not 98% of the natives will not get a census questionnaire in the mail. It has to be hand delivered. They basically turned enumerators into the postal service, and the pandemic hit. And so all the enumerators never showed up. And so as of last week, a few questionnaires are now, being delivered. But we constantly have an undercount by the census.
Siemens said that Native Americans have been undercounted anywhere from 15 to 20%, which impacts tribal government and redistricting. And while the Native American community vote has been under attack, this does beg the question: is this purposeful or just by coincidence?
I've always heard, that the United States is a melting pot where you take and, everybody, the races all blend together. And I guess my take on it is the melting pot I see is racism, malice, and stupidity. And they're mixing them all together and they're coming up with a total different DNA. So when you're talking about, election officials that are not providing equality, sometimes it's, racist. Sometimes that's where the malice comes from. Sometimes, they don't have the qualifications for the job. But a lot of times they're just lazy. I mean, I found that in a lot of areas. It's not that this person's a bad person. The person's just lazy. So you put that in a melting pot too with the rest, and you got pure chaos.
Siemens frames the struggle this way, but remains optimistic.
Being a person of color, being a native, you wake up every day not saying, geez, I think I'm going to go to the park. You wake up in the morning and say, what fight do I have today? It's just something that happens so often that's what you do. The first thing you get up is you look at what you have to take care of in order for you and your people to be better. I'm glad to see our younger generation actually picking up where we left off, or where we'll leave off. But I can tell you too that they have more energy. They're more willing to stand in the front lines, to protest, to take and not just stand idly by.
You should give a fuck, because your vote is supposed to represent your voice in the political system. When your vote is either suppressed or taken away, that is society effectively saying that your input has very little significance or importance. Everyone deserves to be part of the conversation, because at the end of the day, these politicians and elected officials will be making decisions that impact you, whether you participate in it or not.
Welcome back to the part of the show that we don't just talk about you, that we talk with you. I am your humble co-host, Tunigu Falaju.
And I'm Genevieve, your co-host.
Perfect. And today we are joined by a great guest. Her name is Jayla. She's from Dallas, Texas. Don't worry, I already asked her if she's a Cowboys fan. Apparently she is not. And she is an activist, organizer. And Jayla, thank you so much for joining us today. We definitely appreciate you. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So in this particular episode, we sort of dove into the realm of voter rights, and we we explored all sorts of areas of it. So, I'll just ask you sort of broadly speaking, as an activist organizer, and from what I understand, somebody who is fresh out of school. What's your sort of point of view on voting rights, on just the whole landscape of voting? Are you excited about it? Are you energized by it, or is it something that that isn't necessarily where you want to focus your energies on in terms of focusing on actual the voting side of politics?
I would say that personally for me, I had a great focus and interest in voting when I first went to college and I registered for the first time. I also was a precinct chair on campus for my university. And so therefore I was able to delve into the world of voting and voting rights at my university. And with us having a history of voting right issues and voter suppression on our campus, I was really able to get into a different world where I didn't have just a focus on voting rights, but I developed a great passion for them. So my focus in politics is most definitely in voting rights, although I branch off into other things. I think voting as a whole, it does excite me, but also making sure that everyone is having equal opportunity and their rights of being able to exercise their right to vote is very important and is a great focus of mine.
And could you talk a little bit about, I know you've done some voting rights activism on your university. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, so I attended and now graduate of Prairie A&M University, and many people know, and some don't, that Prairie View in the county of Waller has a long history of voter suppression and discrimination on the campus, but also within the city as a whole in Prairie View. The county of Waller is primarily white, and the campus is a historically Black college and university, drawing in a great majority of Black students. In the 70s, we had probably our first case with voting rights, which went all the way to the Supreme Court and really had a focus not only on Prairie View's campus, but also the entire U.S. with giving students or granting students the right to be able to deem residency on their college campus so that they can vote. But also going into 2018, I was a part of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund voting rights lawsuit against the county, where we had went and sued the county because of improper voting practices for early voting on our campus.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually kind of a piece of it that I kind of want to touch on real quick. So from your vantage point, obviously being a recent graduate, what's the sort of like the temperature for people who are your age as far as the importance of voting? Obviously, you're an activist and organizer, so clearly it's important to you. But what was your experiences like trying to sort of get other people to essentially do the same, to have that sort of on their minds as well?
I would say that the beauty of being a activist and organizer, and also had been a precinct chair within the county on my campus, I was able to really interact with a lot of students and young adults who are moving away from home for the first time, and they're registering to vote and voting for the first time. And you see a lot of students who are very hesitant because they have, they've been told in the political atmosphere of my vote doesn't count, or really not knowing the importance of voting. So as precinct chair and also as an activist and organizer on campus and working with other groups, I was able really to do things not only just like voter registration, but also voter education. And so when you go into these classrooms or you go into these groups or circles of young students or just, young people in general, you really have these meaningful conversations about why is it important to vote, why your vote matters, but also I think breaking down the fact that voting in all elections, not just presidential elections, but local elections and state elections as well, and why those are very impactful to you. When you can get someone to see how voting impacts them personally and those who they care about, then you can also reach them at a different point as well. But I think also being on the campus of Prairie View and knowing its history and voter suppression and really, just driving the fact that if your vote doesn't count, then why are they trying so hard to take it away from you? So when you're able to have these meaningful conversations and draw other students and young people in, even if they were hesitant or not really mindful of it before of why their vote is so important or voting is important, then I've seen where we've gone from that point to, making sure that they are registered and voting in every election.
And I'm kind of curious, how does that make you feel when you hear people say, oh, my vote doesn't really matter? Do you get discouraged, especially given the fact that a lot of these voter ID laws are passing, and then in your case in Prairie View where they're trying to restrict students to vote? How does that make you feel? Are you encouraged, discouraged?
Well, I would say at first I wasn't necessarily encouraged or discouraged. I was very upset. It's kind of it's hard trying to necessarily explain why, when for so long you have students or you have young people who are coming from where maybe their household wasn't voting or the people in their community wasn't voting. Like myself growing up, I remember going to the polls with my parents. So that was very different for some people. But when you see that there's an opportunity to have a conversation or to educate or to impact someone and have that transparency of why their vote matters and why they should vote, I think that really becomes encouraging because you see that you have the chance to share some knowledge and wisdom with someone. And in fact, you would hope that they would also share that with someone else who might have been in that position that they once were and knowing the impact of their vote.
Yeah, absolutely. And in this particular episode, we dove a little bit into the actual specific ways that people, that politicians, so to speak, sort of try to suppress the vote. So we touched on a lot of different things like gerrymandering, voter ID laws, as well as, a lot of things going on with the absentee voting right now. So, as somebody who was on campus and kind of organizing and doing these type of things, what were the specific types of sort of ways they would try to sort of disenfranchise, groups of people, be it young people or minorities? What was the specific way that you sort of experienced that, hey, there's definitely an issue here and that needs to be corrected?
Well, I would say that my first encounter was that we had they still have an address problem on campus. And so a week before we actually took out the lawsuit with the NAACP LDF, then we were notified that we were being threatened with hundreds of voter registration cards being thrown out because of the wrong address that was being put on them. This was the same address that was being given to us by the county and had been used for years. And so therefore we were very confused to why now we were getting this notification right before the deadline of being able to meet the registration date to be able to vote in Texas, but also why we weren't being notified before if this was a problem. We actually had to get a letter from the Secretary of State to say that we would not throw out, or they could not throw out those voter registration cards. And in fact, that once they would go and vote in this election or that election, that they would have the chance to have a change of address without being penalized and not being able to vote due to the address problem at hand. That was probably one of our biggest problems before we had noticed the shortening of days and hours given to us in the county.
Wow. Genevieve, do you have anything else?
I have time for one more question. And so I guess my last question would be, so how did you and I guess the student body kind of come together and try to fight that and stand up for your voting rights?
Well, along with myself, but also we had members of our Student Government Association. I work along with a friend and colleague group called PSP, who do a lot of activism and organizing on campus. Also, just student leaders. We also have some recent alums who sit on our city council in Prairie View who came in and lent a hand. So we had really to rally around ourselves, but most importantly, our student leaders, groups like SGA, PSP, myself, those who are in the community and our activists and organizers, alums. I was also able to do a lot of work, of course, as I mentioned, with the Legal Defense Fund, also our state senator, Royce West, and from Dallas, also just other people who knew of the problems that we've had in the past and have really just been able to come in, get involved, lend a hand, lend advice, but also really just a lot of the grassroots groundwork that went on and was able to rally around what the problem was. We planned marches, we've had sit-ins. I mean, you name it, we've done it because of the past that has happened and knowing that it's been a continuous thing with voter suppression. But this past time in which my friends and colleagues were able to come together, it was, like as I mentioned, it was a lot of just on the ground, running, let's do what we can, not really having all that great of experience, but having the passion to the drive to make a change.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I guess we might end on this note. One of the kind of common things that I see is that there's a lot of sort of like apathy when it comes to politics, right? That nothing will ever change, everything's going to stay the same.
Yeah.
But at least in my experience and you know, doing this show and just looking into a vast number of issues, the one common trait is involvement. That, you know, this whole process doesn't work unless you're involved. So, you know, if you're saying, oh man, you know, none of this works for me, you know, it's all, you know, kind of just woeful dread of the whole process. Well, you know, it's going to work one or another. And, you know, it's your choice on whether, you know, you're involved in the process or not. So is there any, you know, sort of like last bit of advice that you'd get somebody who's your age, who's thinking, you know, this is all kind of screwed up and not, you know, it doesn't work for me?
Honestly, I think you really hit it on the head with the idea of involvement. That's one thing I really push as being involved within your community. And I think as I've mentioned before, you know, local elections have such a great impact, but also just knowing and being aware. And a lot of people, they really kind of shy away from the idea of being involved politically, but just to be politically aware, I think makes a difference. And that alone, being politically aware and knowing the things that are going on around in your community and also, you know, across the United States and globally will make an impact on what you do after and how involved you become then. But I think right now, just even in the state that we have with everything going on with like protests and the recent police brutality, we have seen young people come out in droves for a movement that's happening right now. So I think as long as you are politically aware, start there and become involved. I think that's really the focus and where it all starts.
Absolutely. It's very, very beautifully said. So Jayla, I definitely want to thank you for stopping through and talking with us for a bit. We definitely appreciate you and appreciate your efforts too, you know, for what you do. It's not an easy life, to say the very least. So yeah, we thank you for all you do and, you know, we appreciate you.
Thank you for having me anytime.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So with that being said, I think we will go ahead and scoot out of here so we can do some more research, get back to it, and hopefully deliver another episode next week until they cancel us. So Genevieve, I'll let you hit your usual sign off.
All right. Thank you guys for watching. Make sure to catch us every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific time on the Real News YouTube channel. Thanks.
Beautifully said. We will see you next week. Peace.
Bye.